It's Sunday morning, and that wonderfully relaxed feeling of a long, lazy day lingers in the air. If you want to make the moment last, may I suggest the perfect solution: the Martin Sheen Podcast. Join me, your host, Martin Sheen, for beautifully crafted 20-minute programs filled with never-before-heard stories of my life, along with personal reflections and poetry that inspires. The Martin Sheen Podcast is the perfect Sunday refresh, a chance to take a deep breath, relax, and know that the stress of Monday may be just around the corner, but not here, not now. So make this your weekly moment of calm as we explore faith, hope, love, and what it means to be human. And know this journey is ever unfolding as I invite you to see what's next with me, Martin Sheen. And thank you.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. It's story time. People were sitting at home watching TV when the screen cut to black, and then a face appeared. It was Ukraine's president. He was ashen and exhausted, and he announced that his forces had surrendered. Lay down your arms, he seemed to say. The war is over. But it wasn't. The broadcast was a lie, planted in 2022 by Russian-aligned hackers who had breached Ukrainian TV networks. And for a few minutes, millions of people saw a fabricated message of defeat. It didn't end the war, but it did reveal something deeper. Because in modern warfare, the fight for territory is only one front. The other, the invisible one, plays out in the stories that people believe, and you, truth seekers, may already be casualties. This week, we're going to talk about the concept of hybrid war. It blends the visible with the unseen, mixing tanks and trolls, missions and missiles and memes, cyber attacks and economic pressure and political manipulation, and the information that makes all of that make sense. Because media, in this new form of conflict, is not just a bystander, it's the weapon. As Chinese general and philosopher Sun Tzu said, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. In the early 2010s, Russian strategists began describing warfare not just as a clash of armies, but as a contest of narratives. Their doctrine called for information dominance, winning control of perception before a shot is even fired. And state media like Russia Today were built for that purpose. They carry pieces that blur fact and fiction into other countries until audiences can't tell the difference anymore. You can find RT on both Comcast and Dish Network here in the US, as well as on social media and on YouTube. And researchers have traced how these kind of narratives move in line with military operations. One 2017 study found that propaganda content on Russian television got more frequent just before pro-Russia separatists in eastern Ukraine did a big action. The media were used to prepare the psychological battlefield. And it's important to know that disinformation doesn't even have to be persuasive. It just has to be confusing. It kind of floods the space with noise until the signal just disappears. The audience gives up. They stop trying to separate truth from falsehood. They grow cynical and tired, and that fatigue, that feeling that no one can be trusted, that becomes the real victory. Across the hybrid conflicts of the past decade, from Ukraine to Taiwan, from the South China Sea to American elections, we've seen this pattern repeat. If you're a social media user, you've almost certainly been part of an attack. There's fabricated reports, there's deepfake videos, independent think tanks that produce fake polls, anonymous social media accounts that share outrage or schadenfreude through emotional stories that are designed to divide people. and every little piece seems small on its own. But together, they make the world feel unstable, like it's unpredictable and even dangerous. People's perceptions and feelings drive their political choices even before a government would realize that they're under attack. Because the battlefield's not defined by borders anymore, it's defined by bandwidth. Every smartphone, every news feed, every algorithmic timeline is a front line. And every citizen, even you, has become a potential target, because this is the nature of hybrid warfare. It aims to not just destroy infrastructure, but to occupy meaning itself. Here's another example. In early 2024, as Taiwan got ready for a presidential election, voters started seeing realistic videos of candidates saying things that they hadn't actually said. These clips were created by artificial intelligence, and they were timed to exploit things that people disagreed about. One video showed a candidate confessing they were corrupt. Another mocked Taiwan's defenses in the faces of Chinese power. And these messages spread really quickly, faster than officials or real media could correct them. And investigators later confirmed that many of the accounts boosting these videos traced back to coordinated networks in mainland China. The goal wasn't to change the outcome necessarily, but it was to erode confidence, to make people doubt the process itself. Because when trust erodes, democracy falters. And in a hybrid war, that doubt is a strategic weapon. Hybrid tactics don't just come from the outside. Once they take root, they affect domestic politics too. In the United States, we're now weeks into a federal government shutdown, and we're watching our own institutions mimic the logic of information warfare. It started as a failure to pass a spending bill, but it's turned into a meme war. On social media, official government accounts on both sides are using distorted AI-tinted videos to mock their opponents. The governor of New York, a Democrat, posted a deep-fried meme of a red-faced Donald Trump captured, "Bro, shut down the government." The Trump side retaliated with an AI-generated parody of the song "Don't Fear the Reaper," featuring Trump on cowbell and senators in digital cloaks of death. Official cabinet department accounts have joined in, some of them replacing their standard updates with partisan banners, replacing radical left lawmakers for the shutdown. And across the aisle, Democratic pages are posting cartoonish videos with baby talk captions and minion filters to ridicule their opponents. It would really be absurd if it wasn't also working. Because in this meme war, attention is the ammunition, because the goal isn't to convince you, it's just to dominate your feed. To make my side angrier, louder, more shareable, and more emotionally sticky than the other side. But what you may not know is how easily these moments become part of a global information ecosystem. The same memes, the satirical, sarcastic, polarizing ones, get blown up by automated bot networks and troll farms that operate far outside the country's borders. So they make the outrage feel organic, even though it's been manufactured. And so the U.S. shutdown, an internal political event, has become global ammunition. There's trolls that push memes that pit citizens against each other, and it turns dysfunction into spectacle. Government becomes a performance, and foreign actors don't have to invent the chaos. We're doing it ourselves. They just have to amplify it. And this is what scholars of hybrid warfare now describe as information opportunism. It's the ability to weaponize domestic instability by flooding the digital space around it. Hybrid war exploits that imbalance. A 2024 analysis of media operations in the Russia-Ukrainian war called this psychological saturation. It's deliberately flooding the digital space with conflicting narratives. And the goal is to overwhelm, not to persuade, because when people face an endless stream of claims and counterclaims, they just disengage. They stop caring who's right. And when that happens, when the audience just turns away, the aggressor controls the silence. Media platforms are amplifying that effect. Algorithms reward engagement and not accuracy, so they boost whatever promotes emotion, fear or anger or outrage, the same instincts that propaganda is designed to trigger. And as a result, disinformation doesn't just hang out on the margins, it's at the middle of the attention economy. And in this new kind of war, even just scrolling becomes, strategic terrain. What makes hybrid warfare so difficult to confront is that it hides behind ordinary life. It looks like news. It sounds like conversation. It spreads through humor and satire and debate, normal human communication, but it's been repurposed for strategic ends. And it unfolds without open conflict. There's not really a clear line between war and peace, and that ambiguity is intentional because it keeps people hesitant. It divides institutions, and societies are just perpetually uncertain. In a hybrid war, control of the story is control of the field. Disinformation isn't a side effect of conflict, it's more a weapon. It's one that travels faster than a tank, and it can be harder to trace. Modern disinformation operates like a system. The rumor mill analogy is probably too old-fashioned now because it's really more like a well-tuned machine. And it starts with narrative construction. So, state actors and non-state actors alike, they create propaganda that tries to redefine who's the aggressor, who's the victim, and what counts as truth. Russian state media like Russia Today or Sputnik, they do this deliberately, weaving military operations into televised storytelling. But they're not alone. Western governments and alliances also have their own information arms. The U.S. State Department's Global Engagement Center, the UK's 77th Brigade, NATO's Stratcom Center of Excellence. They're all tasked with what they call strategic communication, and that's an official term for shaping public perception to support your policy goals. And the methods look different, but the logic is the same. You want to define the narrative before your opponent does. Now, the second layer is micro-targeting. Once a story is seeded, it gets delivered directly to the audiences that are most likely to amplify it by sharing it. You can think of it as like data-driven warfare. Platforms use data that you have given them, through which you've already chosen to stop at, click on, watch, follow, and they profile you based on who's most likely to be triggered by a particular message. Russia's exploited this approach for years, but Western campaigns have also adopted similar tools. Paid influencer partnerships, promoting military recruitment, psychological operations teams testing narratives on small online communities before they deploy them more widely. During the first weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, for example, Western intelligence agencies coordinated release of declassified satellite images and intercepted communications just to pre-bunk Kremlin claims before they spread. It was a defensive use of information warfare, but it was information warfare nonetheless. Disinformation rarely shows up as an obvious lie. It blends half-truths and selective facts and emotional framing to make something just truthy. It feels like it should be right. U.S. defense analysts call this information shaping. Chinese strategists call it cognitive warfare, and the vocabulary changes, but the function doesn't. In every case, the goal is to occupy the mental space where facts become filtered through identity and through fear. Hybrid actors oftentimes will rely on proxies. In Russia and China, there are independent think tanks, and you can put some quotes around independent, and influencers that launder the official narrative through academic channels or entertainment channels. In the West, governments will outsource message testing to private firms and PR agencies. But algorithms don't care who pays for the post. They only amplify what engages. A 2024 European study warned that coordinated campaigns, even those that are labeled as public information, risk falling into propaganda if the source isn't obvious to the audience, because audiences they studied had stopped distinguishing between persuasion and manipulation. Technology multiplies the reach. There's bot networks that simulate public enthusiasm to trick the algorithm, troll farms manufacture outrage, and in democratic societies, the same concepts go by different names. So we might call it digital engagement or issue advocacy or astroturf campaigns. The tone is softer, but the architecture is really the same. It's emotion, repetition, amplification. Chinese operations around that Taiwan election demonstrated how these systems converge. There were AI-generated deepfakes that circulated hours after the debates, and these were amplified both by domestic sympathizers and by foreign troll networks. Western governments kind of complained about the interference, but at the same time, they also funded their own counter-messaging campaigns aimed at what they called resilience building. Competing truths, and each one algorithmically optimized. Even democratic states fall into the same feedback loop. In 2023, British defense officials quietly acknowledged using the same social media monitoring units to shape sentiment around NATO deployments in Eastern Europe. The European External Action Service runs multilingual rapid response teams to counter false narratives, but sometimes their campaigns might blur correction with advocacy. And in the U.S., federal agencies have experimented with what they call behavioral science units to nudge online discourse around things like vaccines and voting and foreign policy. They may be intending to stabilize and to govern well, but that method, targeted influence through data, is really indistinguishable from the tactics that they condemn abroad. So the architecture of disinformation isn't just foreign, it's systemic, and there's three overlapping objectives that drive it. First, you destabilize perception, so you flood social media with conflicting stories until certainty collapses. Then, you need to manipulate emotion, so you direct public anger or sympathy toward targets that you've chosen to make them seem like they're less legitimate. You call news fake news, for example. And eventually, you can reinforce allegiance to this new false reality that you've developed. You keep your domestic audiences aligned with your objectives by framing any doubt as disloyalty. If you want to answer questions like, are Latin Americans all dangerous criminals running fentanyl? Or does everyone have a fair chance at education to qualify for college admissions? Or do illegal immigrants get free health care under the Affordable Care Act? If you don't want the National Guard in your city, or you don't want your university to lose federal research dollars, you're going to be careful how you answer those kind of questions. Every nation that practices information warfare moves through these stages, and the language of justification changes. Some call it countering extremism, some call it defending democracy. But this kind of disinformation works because it hides in plain sight. Most citizens will encounter it as normal communication, tweets from officials, press releases, shareable memes. There's an AI Trump that dumps poop on protesters. Kitty explains why the Republicans are responsible for the shutdown and some Democrat posts. It feels like other stuff you see online. And the more relatable the tone is, the deeper it reaches. Western officials now talk openly about the need to win the narrative. Hybrid warfare doesn't distinguish between good intent and bad technique. It just rewards effectiveness. And because the tactics now circulate globally, no one can fully claim the moral high ground. The battle for perception has become mutual, it's become constant, and it's become borderless. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll talk about why this is important for you as a possible casualty in this hybrid war. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Before the break, we traced how disinformation works as a system. It's built and managed and deployed by both authoritarian and democratic states. But knowing how the machine operates doesn't tell you about what it does to people. So the next part is about strategy and consequence. So you could imagine someone like Irina. Maybe she's a teacher in Odessa in Ukraine, and she's checking Telegram every morning for updates about air raids and humanitarian aid. Is it safe to go outside? And at first this was like a lifeline for her. But slowly the messages start to contradict each other. There's some interesting channels, you don't know who they are, and each one is claiming that they have inside information. Some are obviously fake, and others you just don't know. And after a while, Irina just puts her phone down, because it's better to know nothing, she thinks, than to be fooled again. Now, our imaginary Irina isn't real, but researchers studying Ukraine's media landscape have uncovered thousands of people just like her, citizens overwhelmed by a torrent of conflicting messages. There was a 2024 study where media scholars described how ordinary Ukrainians faced informational exhaustion, trying to sort through Telegram feeds where official warnings, rumors, propaganda, they all just blended into a kind of a digital noise. And another researcher found that exposure to manipulated news created what she called psychological fog, eroding trust in even verified sources. And that's the emotional terrain of hybrid warfare. It's not so much panic, but fatigue. And eventually that fatigue becomes silence, because hybrid warfare erodes trust in layers. The first is personal, right? What you see, what you believe. And the second is institutional, what you think of the systems that are meant to protect you. A decade ago, most people trusted at least one stable source, a newspaper, or a particular broadcaster, or a political party. But today, the same technologies that promised democratized communication have fractured that trust into 1,000 different pieces, and you see the consequences everywhere. In the U.S., surveys show that fewer than 1 in 3 adults express a great deal of trust in national news. And when millions of people are watching official accounts trading memes and insults instead of solutions, it just kind of confirms your worst assumption, right? That governance itself isn't really useful anymore. It's just performance. And functionally, this ends up as half the legislative branch of the government doesn't even show up to work. You can see some of the same things in the European Union. Disinformation researchers have tracked online campaigns designed to portray Brussels as both powerless and authoritarian, claims that both foreign bots and domestic populist movements are amplifying, and so people just lose their faith in collective action. Every country turns inward, and they're defensive and isolated countries are a lot less effective in sanctioning others for invasions and human rights violations and other things. That same erosion plays out across different societies, with the same emotional signature of fatigue. Now, from the perspective of platforms, division is awesome because it keeps people scrolling and makes you money. Performative outrage feels powerful even to people who read it. An insulting meme from the governor of California feels like a slight, and a responding one from the president feels like a vindication. Or the reverse. It works both ways. And political actors learn to weaponize that energy. They don't have to coordinate with troll farms because the audience does the work for them with their likes and their shares. There was a 2020 for a European study on digital polarization that called this autopropaganda, the process by which democratic societies start to manipulate themselves. Because once those tools of persuasion become normalized, they're used by everyone. The line between influence and manipulation dissolves, and then that trust crisis becomes structural. Institutions that were designed to stabilize truth, the press, the courts, universities, they lose their authority. Journalists fact-check, but corrections only reach people who believe in the concept of correction. Courts publish rulings, but the population thinks they aren't neutral anymore. Scientists present evidence, but data itself has become politicized. Hybrid warfare didn't create these fractures, but it sure exploited them. And now, the information ecosystem is feeding on its own instability. In another study using focus groups across Europe, respondents were asked how they verify news. And most of them didn't cite newspapers or television. They said friends, influencers, or their gut feeling. Now, it's not that people don't care about truth. They do. It's that they don't trust any institution to deliver it. And this has huge ramifications for democracy. Because when citizens can't agree on basic facts, you can't create policy. People don't govern, they act. And it feels like politics has become a reality show that's just staged for algorithmic applause. Disinformation then stops needing an author, it just kind of runs itself. In a hybrid war, this breakdown is so important because a divided society cannot defend itself. That polarization becomes paralysis, and that makes external aggressors free to act. There's a phrase that analysts who study information warfare use called cognitive attrition. It means slowing down a population's capacity to discern or care or decide. You can think of it like the mental equivalent of trench warfare. There's no explosions, just exhaustion. And that's where we're at right now. We're not just fighting over information, but over attention and meaning and belief. And the longer it goes on, the less we remember what peace of mind felt like. When people no longer know who to trust, they stop asking who's accountable. And in that space between confusion and law, hybrid warfare kind of takes cover. Because the modern battlefield isn't just invisible, it's often undefined and ungoverned. There is not a single body of international law that fully even defines hybrid warfare. The Geneva Conventions were written for wars you could see, right? Armies in uniforms and front lines. And the UN Charter forbids the use of force against another state's sovereignty. But what happens when the weapon is a disinformation campaign or a cyber intrusion or a proxy military that operates in someone else's uniform? The answer right now is it depends. International law separates conflict into kind of two categories. The right to go to war, and then the laws that govern conduct during that war. And hybrid warfare kind of sits in the middle. A cyber attack that disables a hospital might meet the definition of an armed attack. But what about a campaign that spreads deepfakes or funds extremist media? That kind of falls into a legal twilight. It's hostile, but maybe it's not illegal. It's in a gray zone. Now, some legal scholars have tried to map it. There's something called the Talon Manuals that is compiled by experts in international law that tries to apply existing rules to cyber operations. They acknowledge that digital actions can violate sovereignty if they cause serious harm, but most hybrid attacks are then designed to just not cross that threshold. They're kind of calibrated to stay right below it. You look for plausible deniability, right? You do enough damage to destabilize, but not enough to trigger Article 51 of the UN Charter, which allows for self-defense. And this is why attribution, proving who did what, matters so much. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it used soldiers without insignia, the little green men. When immigration raids are sweeping U.S. cities in 2025, sometimes the vans are unmarked and the officers are masked. When China flooded social media with AI-generated content around Taiwan's election, it did it with civilian accounts and shell companies. Because that ambiguity becomes a part of the defense. If no one can prove who's responsible, no one can legally respond. Now, Western democracies face a different version of the problem. They will usually call their hybrid tactics defensive, right? Strategic communication, counter disinformation, information resilience. But the legal distinctions aren't always that clear. If the US or the UK funds a digital campaign to influence an audience abroad, which they do, are they practicing public diplomacy or information warfare? Did Congress or Parliament declare a war? When NATO releases preemptive intelligence to shape public opinion before a crisis, is that transparency or is that coercion by narrative? The tools are the same, it's just the justification that changes, and that's what makes regulation so tough. Most international law was built on the idea that states are the only actors that matter. But hybrid conflict thrives on proxies, private firms, online collectives that cross borders with ease. a troll farm in St. Petersburg, a cybersecurity contractor in Washington, a PR agency in London. They're all managing strategic narratives for a defense ministry. And each one plays a role, but there's not a single law that governs them all. As one NATO report phrased it, hybrid warfare is conflict designed to avoid legal definition. There are countries trying to fill the gap. So the EU has a Digital Services Act that requires major platforms to remove coordinated disinformation networks and to disclose political advertising. NATO's issued updates calling information operations a part of multi-domain warfare. The United States has had fits and starts at legislation to limit deepfakes and election content. This one has a lot of trouble when it runs into the First Amendment. But enforcement is really uneven because laws move really slowly and technology does not. So the legal gray zone shows how unprepared our systems are for this kind of conflict. But there are still things we can do. Governments can adapt, institutions can coordinate, and ordinary citizens can learn to resist manipulation, just kind of one habit at a time. Governments are beginning to shift from reaction to prevention. So NATO has a hybrid center in Helsinki that trains member states to recognize early signs of information attacks, and it connects intelligence agencies and ministries and civil institutions so that the verified information might move faster than the rumor. The United States calls this integrated deterrence, a strategy for responding across military, economic, and digital domains at the same time. And the UK has built similar networks, merging cyber defense and counter-disinformation teams under one structure. But coordination only matters if the public still believes what it hears, and that's why transparency has become a form of national defense. Some governments release verified information quickly and without spin, so that leaves less space for falsehoods to grow. The National Defense University summarized this well a bunch of years ago. The best answer to propaganda is not counter-propaganda, but credible communication. Resilience also depends on the society, not just the state, because hybrid warfare targets every weakness: economic, political, cultural, psychological, so you have to have defense in every layer. Across Europe, education systems are integrating media literacy into civic life. For example, in Finland, high school students learn to check sources, trace images, recognize emotional framing. In Ukraine, journalists and volunteers collaborate to track Telegram channels and confirm satellite images. They call this information defense, and it's a phrase that kind of captures both urgency and purpose. And these kind of small, methodical efforts help to keep that panic from becoming paralysis. The private sector matters too, because most of what modern societies depend on, energy and transportation and finance and communication, is privately owned, and that makes it a target. So governments and companies are now sharing threat intelligence more openly. Cybersecurity firms exchanging data with national agencies, banks working with law enforcement to trace illicit funding, sometimes social media platforms coordinating with election officials to spot coordinated influence campaigns. It's an imperfect system for sure, but it does distribute resilience because not one failure can collapse everything. Yet even with these systems in place, resilience ultimately depends on you. Every false story, every piece of outrage bait, it relies on us to share it. A moment's hesitation can help break that chain, just checking the sources, cross-referencing the headline, or simply asking who benefits if we believe this. These are small acts of resistance, but together they slow the speed that lies can travel at. Research from Ukraine shows that citizens who routinely verify information and discuss it with others are far less likely to fall for manipulative content. And none of this works without accountability. Governments can't demand transparency abroad while withholding information at home. Media outlets can't condemn disinformation while they profit from the outrage. Platforms can't claim they're neutral while they design systems that reward division. Accountability is the way that trust repairs itself. And when institutions admit their mistakes, they regain some of that credibility. When journalists explain how they verify information, they teach from example. When public officials show their evidence, they make the truth visible. Hybrid warfare thrives on secrecy, and openness starves it. And in the end, the strongest defense isn't a firewall or an algorithm, it's attention. Every time we pause before we react or share, we weaken the system that's designed to use us. Being an informed citizen today doesn't mean knowing everything, but it does mean questioning wisely and remembering that skepticism is not the same thing as cynicism. Hybrid war is not going away. It's inexpensive, it's adaptable, and it works. But understanding it does weaken it, and awareness itself can be a deterrent. Truth still works, it just takes longer. And that needs to start not just with governments or algorithms, but with us, with what we trust, with what we share, and with what kind of world we choose to sustain. Stay sharp, truth seekers. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone. It's no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, Unspun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to Unspun today. Unspun, because you deserve the truth.